He registered, or was, I should say, I think it's now over, but for a period of some years he was a registered sex offender in Texas, and he was convicted of exposing himself in public. And I just recently read about another Unitarian Universalist minister who was convicted of exposing himself in public and so on. So I guess there's a certain amount of exhibitionist Unitarian Universalist ministers, although it's not always exhibitionism per se. In the case of Reverend Douglas Morgan Strong, it appears that it was a form of gay cruising, as it were. In other words, he was exposing himself publicly in the hopes of attracting sexual partners, according to my understanding of his case. So, yeah, another image-tarnishing Unitarian Universalist minister who was on the short list to be interim moderator of the Unitarian Universalist Association when I believe it was Dennis Davidoff resigned, and they needed to fill the gap between her and the next full-time UUA moderator. A bunch of Unitarian Universalist ministers were, on the list. Thank you, sir. Got a nice honk and look from someone, and I do get a certain amount of public support. So anyway, getting back to Douglas Morgan Strong, he basically applied, or was even possibly nominated by someone else to be interim minister of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And interestingly enough, at the same time, Calvin O. Dame, another minister guilty of clergy sexual misconduct, essentially having affairs with the wives of his congregants, if I understand correctly. He also was, on the list to be the interim minister of the UUA. So here we have two Unitarian Universalist ministers, both guilty of sexual offenses. Well, in the case of Calvin O. Dame, it may not have been a criminal offense. I'm not sure if having an affair with your congregant's wife is a crime in Maine. In some states it would be. Not sure what the legal situation is in Maine, but in any case, two Unitarian Universalist ministers who are certainly guilty of sexual misconduct, as it is normally defined, were on the list, and it wasn't a big list, to be interim moderator of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Oh, and then there's Reverend Bill Sinkford. Bill Sinkford, yes, he became president of the UUA, even after having had a fairly serious clergy sexual misconduct complaint brought against him, prior to becoming president. He, as I understand it, had a fling or an affair with a ministerial intern, and this came to light at a UUAGA, apparently. In other words, he was sort of in his hotel, and another minister saw him in terms of, having the fling, and reported him. And, he had a clergy sexual misconduct complaint brought against him, and I'm not sure exactly what happened with that, but, as a rule, these things sort of get swept under the carpet. But, it was a known fact. Reverend Deborah Pope Lance made a big fuss about it at the time, and when Reverend Bill Sinkford was running for president, I believe Reverend Deborah Pope Lance, who deals with clergy sexual misconduct issues, she's one of the, or was one of the advocates for clergy sex abuse victims and so on, she definitely made an issue of Reverend Bill Sinkford's clergy sexual misconduct when he ran for president of the UUA and became persona non grata as a result of that. So here's, top level, representative of the Unitarian Universalist Association who's guilty of clergy sexual misconduct, as it is defined, by the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association and the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. So, and actually he he ended up having a rather nasty divorce as a result. He was divorced from his first wife, perhaps partly as a result of that. I mean, I'm not sure that was the whole reason, but it was certainly part of it, from what I understand from reliable sources. So yeah, image tarnishing ministers. Oh, and then there's, you know, the non-sexual stuff. Well, I mean, Ray Drennan was non-sexual stuff, but you know, if you bring it back to the non-sexual stuff, I'd say the I'm unbelievable? No, actually, that's an entirely truthful statement, and you can check the facts. Look for Reverend Gail Seavey's Berry Street essay she wrote about and spoke about Unitarian Universalist clergy sex abuse this year at the UUAGA. So don't take my word for it, take the word of Unitarian Universalist ministers and UUA leaders. So this woman says I'm unbelievable after looking at the slogan, which we're walking back to. And it's actually an incredibly, actually I shouldn't use that word, incredibly. It's a very, very believable slogan once you check the facts. Unitarians cover up clergy sex abuse. What's unbelievable about that? You know, does this woman really believe that Unitarians never at any time covered up clergy sex abuse? But the fact of the matter is that Unitarians regularly and often cover up clergy sexual abuse. You know, how many clergy sexual abuse cases in terms of the Unitarian Church are known publicly? Well, a small handful essentially, but according to, again, well-informed, reliable sources within the Unitarian Universalist Church itself, no less than 400 Unitarian Universalist congregations have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. So there's been at least 400 cases, and in fact, almost certainly significantly more. That's basically a bottom-end number. What happened is a group of Unitarian Universalist interim ministers started counting one day how many Unitarian Universalist congregations had been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. You know, how many Unitarian Universalist congregations were known to have had at least one case of clergy sexual misconduct. Well, they stopped counting when they reached 400. I guess they were kind of disillusioned and disappointed, and they just literally stopped counting when they reached 400. So, you know, they might have counted 2 or 3 more. They might have counted 20 more. They might have counted a couple of hundred more. They might have even counted 400 more. There's 1,000+ Unitarian Universalist congregations in the Unitarian Universalist Association, and it's not out of the question that 80% of them have had one form of clergy sexual misconduct or another at one time or another since the merger of the Unitarians with the Universalists in 1961, especially in light of, you know, the fact that an absolute minimum of 400 have, you know, why stop counting? So as it is, we're getting to the end of a half-hour reel, as it were. You know, people who are in the know, people who are knowledgeable about Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, I'm talking about Unitarian Universalist ministers who know what they're talking about and aren't totally secretive, as most of the others are, estimate that, you know, 2/3 or more of Unitarian Universalist churches have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct. That's, you know, 66%. That's like 660 plus, 700 or so Unitarian Universalist churches that are estimated to have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct by Unitarian Universalists themselves. And how many have we heard about? You know, how many cases do we know about? Very, very, very few. And in the whole span of Unitarian Universalist history, so I'm talking about since the merger, I'm talking about since 1961. I'm not talking about before 1961. I'm talking about the last, 55 years or so. Only 20 or so Unitarian Universalist ministers have faced any kind of, accountability for clergy sexual misconduct. Only 20. And the accountability that they faced was very often quite minimal. A few did get, caught for criminal stuff and went to jail. But I'm talking about accountability within the Unitarian Universalist religious community itself. From that perspective, as I understand it, only about 20 ministers out of literally hundreds that were found to have been guilty of clergy sexual misconduct, only 20 faced any kind of accountability. I think that says something about how Unitarian Universalists deal with clergy sexual misconduct. They essentially sweep it under the rug. They essentially pretend it didn't happen, or if it did happen, well, it's no big deal, we can live with it, it's not the worst thing in the world, blah, blah, blah. So yes, Unitarians do in fact cover up clergy sex abuse. And in my case, they tried to cover up clergy sex abuse that I blogged about by threatening to have me charged with the criminal act of blasphemous libel. That's an attempt to cover up and hide at least my version of events. And my version of events was very truthful, based on newspaper reports and so on. And yet the Unitarian Universalist Association tried to pretend that my blog posts about Unitarian Universalist pedophiles and rapists were unfounded, which is absolutely not the case. And, went so far as to pretend that they were so defamatory that they constituted the criminal act of blasphemous libel. Well, guess what? The only circumstance under which criticism of Unitarian Universalist pedophiles and rapists could possibly constitute the criminal act of blasphemous libel is if pedophilia and rape are sacred to Unitarian Universalists. Isn't that hilarious? On that note, I think this is going to wrap up. But yes, do Unitarians hold such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape to be sacred